The slap rang out sharply, echoing through the first-class cabin. Conversations halted instantly and every passenger froze. All eyes turned toward seat 1A, where a stunned silence filled the air. The flight attendant's hand still hovered in the space where she had just struck him. Her face was twisted with anger, convinced that she had just put an unruly passenger in his place. But what she didn't know, the man she had just insulted wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner of the entire airline. And in just a few moments her entire world was about to collapse. The first-class cabin was nearly full, a low hum of conversation blending with the faint rustling of newspapers and the clinking of crystal glasses. Seated in 1A, Marcus sat quietly, flipping through a magazine with a relaxed posture. Unlike the other passengers, he wasn't making a spectacle of himself, loudly discussing multi-million-dollar business deals or demanding special treatment. He traveled often and he preferred to keep things simple. His black dress shirt was neatly pressed, the sleeves rolled up slightly to reveal a luxury watch, not flashy but any connoisseur would recognize it as something reserved for the elite. His dark slacks fit perfectly, polished leather shoes resting lightly on the floor. He carried himself with effortless confidence. But to Rachel, the flight attendant assigned to first class that evening, there was something about him that didn't sit right. Rachel had been working flights for over 10 years. She knew first-class passengers, how they acted, how they looked, how they spoke. They were confident, demanding, sometimes entitled. But they all had one thing in common: they made it clear they belonged there. Marcus, however? He was too quiet, too composed, too unfazed. He wasn't on a phone call, wasn't checking emails, wasn't speaking in low, self-important tones about stocks or real estate. He was just sitting there, flipping through a magazine as if he could be anywhere. Rachel passed by him once. Then again. Each time she stole another glance, her unease growing with every step. Rachel took a slow breath as she approached seat 1A once more. Years of experience had trained her to trust her instincts, and something about Marcus still didn't sit right with her. The ticket was valid. His name matched the manifest. There was no logical reason to keep questioning him, yet that nagging feeling in her gut refused to subside. She stopped beside him, placing one hand on the headrest of the empty seat in front of him. Her tone was polite but firmer this time. "Sir, I just need to confirm, are you traveling alone?" Marcus lowered his magazine again, his dark brown eyes meeting hers. There was no irritation, no confusion, just quiet patience. "Yes, I am," he answered smoothly. Rachel forced a smile, though it was tight. "And this ticket, it wasn't upgraded, was it?" For a brief moment, Marcus simply watched her, as if he were reading something beyond her words. Then in that same calm, measured tone he replied, "No, it wasn't upgraded. I purchased it." Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around the manifest she still clutched. His answer was simple, direct, and completely reasonable. But instead of putting her at ease, it only unsettled her more. He wasn't defensive, wasn't nervous, wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just waiting. She hesitated, then took it one step further. "Do you mind showing me your ID?" A flicker of awareness passed through Marcus's gaze. Not annoyance, not anger, but something close to amusement. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid out his identification. Without a word, he handed it to her. Rachel took it, scanning the details carefully. His name matched. His face was right there on the ID. There was nothing out of place. And yet, for some reason, she stood there a second too long, gripping the card as if it would somehow reveal what her instincts were screaming at her. Marcus finally broke the silence. His voice was still calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. "Is there a problem, miss?" Rachel's stomach tightened. Something in the way he said it, the controlled tone, the subtle shift in his posture, made her feel like she had just stepped into something much bigger than she realized. Forcing herself to stay composed, she handed the ID back. "No problem," she said quickly, her voice clipped. "Enjoy your flight." Marcus took his ID without another word, slipping it back into his wallet before picking up his magazine again, dismissing the exchange as if it had never happened. But Rachel wasn't done. As she turned on her heel and walked back toward the galley, her mind was racing. There had to be something she was missing. Something wasn't right, she just had to prove it. Rachel walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, but her mind refused to let go of Marcus. She had checked his ticket, verified his ID, everything was in order. So why couldn't she shake this feeling? She had dealt with countless passengers over the years, and one thing she had always trusted was her intuition. She stood near the service station, arms crossed, stealing another glance at seat 1A. Marcus had returned to his magazine, completely unbothered by what had just happened. No nervous fidgeting, no stolen glances, no reaction of someone who knew they were under suspicion. And that only made Rachel even more uneasy. Beside her, Lisa, another flight attendant, was preparing drinks. She noticed the tension on Rachel's face and raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Rachel kept her voice low, eyes still locked on Marcus. "The passenger in 1A. Something about him feels off." Lisa frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Rachel took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts into words. "He's too calm. Too at ease. Not like the usual first-class passengers." Lisa sighed, sneaking a glance at Marcus before turning back to Rachel. "Did you check his ticket?" Rachel nodded. "Yes." "His ID?" "Yes." Lisa shrugged. "Then what's the problem?" Rachel pressed her lips together, gripping the passenger manifest in her hands. "I don't know. But I'm going to find out." Ignoring Lisa's skeptical look, Rachel turned toward the intercom system and pressed the call button for ground control. "This is Rachel, lead flight attendant for Flight 417. I need a verification on a first-class passenger, Marcus Reynolds, seat 1A. The line was silent for a moment, then the sound of typing came through. "Hold on," the voice on the other end said. Another pause stretched out and Rachel found herself gripping the phone tighter. Finally the voice returned. "Ticket was purchased under the name Marcus Reynolds. Paid in full. No upgrades. No irregularities." Rachel bit her lip. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, to find some loophole. But there was nothing. Everything was legitimate. She exhaled slowly. "Understood. Thank you." As she hung up, she turned back to find Lisa watching her with a smirk. "Let me guess, nothing suspicious?" Rachel didn't answer. She just stood there, mind racing. She had no proof, no logical reason to keep questioning him. And yet, the feeling hadn't gone away. And if there was one thing she knew for certain, it never did. Rachel clenched her jaw as she scrolled through the manifest once more, her finger hovering over Marcus Reynolds' name. Every detail was correct. No last-minute seat changes, no suspicious notes, nothing that justified the uneasy feeling twisting in her stomach. Lisa, still watching her with mild amusement, shook her head. "Rachel, you're obsessing." Rachel didn't answer. She tapped her fingers against the tablet, thinking. If she couldn't find anything wrong on paper, she would find it another way. Her gaze flickered toward the curtain separating the galley from first class. If there was something off about Marcus, she would catch it before the flight was over. Straightening her uniform, Rachel took a breath and stepped back into the cabin. She moved through the aisle, tending to passengers, but her attention remained locked on seat 1A. Every time she passed, she stole a glance, watching, waiting. Marcus, however, remained completely composed. He continued flipping through his magazine, occasionally checking his phone, never once showing the slightest bit of concern. He wasn't trying to hide. He wasn't trying to prove he belonged. He simply existed in the space as if he owned it. And somehow that made Rachel even more suspicious. She made her way toward Michael, another flight attendant who was offering drinks to the first-class passengers. As he reached Marcus's seat, Rachel slowed her steps, just close enough to listen. Michael smiled politely. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" Marcus looked up, meeting his gaze with that same measured calm. "Just water, please." Michael nodded, poured the drink and handed it to him. "Here you go." Marcus accepted it with a quiet thank you before returning to his magazine. Rachel frowned. That was it? No special requests, no demanding tone, no air of entitlement like so many first-class passengers carried. He was as polite and ordinary as could be. Yet, the unease in her gut remained. As Michael returned to the galley, Rachel stepped beside him. "What do you think of 1A?" she asked in a hushed tone. Michael blinked. "The guy who just asked for water? What about him?" Rachel lowered her voice. "Doesn't he seem out of place?" Michael glanced toward the cabin, then back at her with a frown. "No. He seems normal. Quiet, polite. Honestly, better than half the people up there." Rachel pressed her lips together. "I don't know. I just have a feeling." Michael let out a short laugh. "Rachel, you need to stop doing this." But Rachel wasn't listening. She cast another glance at Marcus, her suspicion burning brighter than ever. If something was wrong, she would find out. She just had to be patient. Rachel could feel her pulse in her ears as she moved through the first-class cabin, forcing herself to focus on other passengers. She refilled drinks, adjusted overhead bins, and smiled at the entitled businessmen who barely acknowledged her presence. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, her mind kept drifting back to seat 1A. Each time she passed, she stole another glance at Marcus. He remained composed, his posture relaxed, his attention flicking between his magazine and his phone. Nothing about him was out of line. Nothing suggested he didn't belong. And yet, Rachel couldn't shake the unease coiling in her stomach. Then she saw it. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen as he typed something. His expression remained neutral, unreadable, but Rachel swore there was something deliberate about the way he moved. Like he was planning something. Like he was waiting. Her nails tapped against the counter as she stood near the galley, deep in thought. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Lisa and Michael were right. Maybe she was seeing a problem that didn't exist. Or maybe she was the only one paying close enough attention. Rachel inhaled sharply, straightening her uniform. If there was something off about Marcus, she would find out. And if he didn't belong in first class, she would make sure this was the last time he ever sat there. She just needed proof. And she wasn't about to let this go. Rachel steadied herself, forcing her expression into one of polite professionalism. She wasn't about to let Marcus sense her growing frustration. If no one else was going to take this seriously, then she would handle it herself. She approached seat 1A with measured steps, placing a hand lightly on the headrest of the empty seat across the aisle. Marcus didn't look up immediately. He was still staring out the window, fingers tapping that same slow, deliberate rhythm against the armrest. Rachel cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Reynolds." This time, Marcus turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. There was no surprise in his gaze, no annoyance, just quiet patience as if he had been expecting this moment. Rachel forced a polite smile. "I just need to confirm one more thing with you." A few passengers shifted slightly in their seats, their curiosity piqued. Marcus, however, remained perfectly still, watching her with an almost amused detachment. Rachel took a breath and tilted her head. "Would you mind telling me what you do for a living?" For the first time since boarding, something in Marcus's expression shifted. Not shock, not offense, but something far more unsettling. A knowing look. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass of water, took a slow, measured sip, then set it back down with the same calculated ease he had displayed all evening. Finally, he met her gaze and spoke, his voice calm, steady. "I own an airline." Silence. Rachel felt the breath catch in her throat. A few heads nearby subtly turned, passengers now openly listening. She forced out a small, stiff laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. "You own an airline?" Marcus simply nodded. "That's what I said." Rachel's stomach twisted. There was no arrogance in his tone, no need to convince her, just a quiet certainty that sent a chill down her spine. She stared at him, waiting for an explanation, a clarification, anything. But Marcus simply leaned back in his seat, watching her with the patience of someone who knew exactly how this was going to play out. Rachel had been so sure of herself, so certain that something was off. And now, for the first time, she felt the first prick of doubt. Who exactly was Marcus Reynolds? And more importantly, what had she just done? Rachel's mind raced, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. This had to be a joke. A power play. Some wealthy executive exaggerating his importance. But as she looked into Marcus's eyes, she didn't see arrogance or deception, only quiet certainty. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, some clearly intrigued, others skeptical. But Marcus? He just sat there, perfectly composed, as if he had all the time in the world. Rachel forced out a polite laugh, though her throat felt tight. "You own an airline?" Marcus nodded once. "That's what I said." Rachel's fingers instinctively curled against the seat in front of her. He wasn't elaborating. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He had simply stated a fact and was now watching her, waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to push further, to demand clarification, to find a flaw in his claim. But something about his presence made her hesitate. What if he wasn't lying? She swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had previously been lost in their own worlds were now subtly tuned in, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Rachel had handled demanding businessmen, celebrities who thought the world revolved around them, and first-class passengers who wielded their wealth like a weapon. She knew how to manage difficult situations. But Marcus? He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't flashing his status. He was playing a different kind of game, one she wasn't sure she knew how to win. She straightened her posture, clearing her throat. "Well, that's impressive, Mr. Reynolds." Marcus's lips twitched slightly, as if amused by her attempt to regain control of the conversation. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them again, thick and heavy. Rachel knew she had two options. Walk away and pretend this exchange never happened, or keep pushing and risk making a fool of herself. She had never backed down before. But for the first time she wasn't sure if she should. Rachel gripped the counter tighter, her breath coming out unsteady. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like I should have already known. Lisa blinked, then let out a dry chuckle. And you actually believe him? Rachel hesitated. That was the problem, she did. And she had no idea why. Lisa set down her paperwork, eyeing Rachel with mild amusement. So let me get this straight. You think a billionaire secretly booked a flight on his own airline, sat in first class like a regular passenger, and just happened to get questioned by you? She crossed her arms. Really? Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. When Lisa said it like that, it did sound ridiculous. But there was something in the way Marcus had looked at her, the certainty in his voice, the complete lack of concern, like he wasn't just confident in what he was saying, but in how this would all play out. Rachel exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't know. But I have a bad feeling. Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. Rachel, you've been fixated on this guy since the moment he sat down. You checked his ticket, his ID, you even called ground control. What else do you need? An official letter from corporate confirming his identity. Rachel stiffened at that. Because the idea suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. She glanced back toward the first-class cabin, just in time to see Marcus take another sip of his water, his movements slow and deliberate. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. If he was telling the truth, she had just made a massive mistake. And if he wasn't, she was about to find out the hard way. Rachel turned slowly to Lisa, her throat dry. It means he's not just some rich guy in first class, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He's important. Really important. Lisa's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine concern. Wait, how important? Rachel swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the tablet. This only happens for high-level executives, government officials, or people with enough power that their travel records are locked. She inhaled sharply. I've never seen it happen for a regular first-class passenger. Lisa's expression darkened as she processed Rachel's words. So, if his profile is restricted, that means he really could be. Rachel cut her off. It means I just messed up. Badly. Lisa reached for the tablet, but Rachel instinctively pulled it back. Panic was settling in now, the full weight of her actions crashing over her. She had questioned him. Pushed him. Treated him like an imposter in a space he not only had the right to be in, but possibly owned. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she stared at the screen. Access restricted. It was more than just a security tag. It was a warning. Rachel had worked in first class long enough to know the unspoken rule. You never question the wrong person. She had served politicians, CEOs, even royalty. But Marcus? She had interrogated him. Challenged him. And now she had no idea what was coming next. Lisa's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Rachel, what do we do? Rachel slowly turned toward the first-class cabin. Marcus was still seated in 1A, composed as ever. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't upset. In fact, he looked like a man who had already won. Her stomach twisted. She had made a mistake. A massive one. And now she just had to wait for the consequences. Rachel nodded and straightened her uniform, forcing herself to stay composed. She had already pushed too far. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. Without another word, she turned and made her way toward the cockpit, each step feeling heavier than the last. Lisa hissed behind her, Rachel, think about this, but Rachel didn't stop. She reached the cockpit door and knocked lightly. A few seconds passed before Captain Reynolds cracked it open, his brows furrowed. Something wrong? Rachel hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside the dimly lit cockpit. The captain's expression turned serious as he crossed his arms. Talk to me? Rachel took a steadying breath. I think we have someone important on board. Very important. First Officer Patel glanced up from his tablet, sensing the tension in her voice. Define important. Rachel's throat tightened. Marcus Reynolds. Seat 1A. He told me he owns an airline. The silence that followed was suffocating. Captain Reynolds didn't react immediately, but there was a shift in his posture. Subtle but unmistakable. Patel frowned. That doesn't make sense. We would know if... But Reynolds cut him off. What exactly did he say? Rachel forced herself to recall every detail. I asked what he did for a living. He didn't hesitate. He just looked at me and said, I own an airline. She exhaled shakily. And when I checked our internal system, his profile was locked. Patel and Reynolds exchanged a glance. Rachel's stomach churned. They knew something. The captain turned to his tablet, typing quickly into the secure airline database. The screen flickered and then he let out a slow, measured breath. Rachel's pulse spiked. What? Reynolds turned the screen toward her. There, in bold letters, was Marcus Reynolds' full name and title. Marcus Reynolds, Chairman and Majority Stakeholder, Atlantic Global Airways. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. She had just humiliated the owner of the airline she worked for. Patel let out a low whistle. Well, that's a problem. Rachel's breathing turned shallow as the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career-ending. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temple. You need to fix this. Now. Rachel swallowed hard. How? The captain's voice was firm. You're going to apologize. Publicly. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent the entire flight doubting Marcus, treating him like he didn't belong. Now she had to correct it, in front of everyone. And there was no way out. Rachel swallowed hard. I asked for his ticket, his ID. I even called ground control for verification. Everything checked out, but... Reynolds' expression darkened. But what? Rachel clenched her hands at her sides. I still didn't believe he belonged. The weight of her own words settled over her like a crushing force. She had spent the entire flight convinced that Marcus was out of place, despite every piece of evidence proving otherwise. First Officer Patel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And now you're telling us he's a VIP? Rachel's throat tightened. Not just any VIP. She forced herself to say it. Marcus Reynolds. He owns Atlantic Global Airways. Silence. The air in the cockpit felt suffocating. Reynolds blinked once, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned back to the tablet and began typing. A few tense seconds passed before the screen flickered to life. Rachel didn't have to see it, she already knew what it would say. Finally, Reynolds let out a slow, measured breath. He turned the screen toward her. There it was. Marcus Reynolds, Chairman and Majority Stakeholder, Atlantic Global Airways. Rachel's stomach plummeted. Patel let out a low whistle. Well, damn. Rachel could barely breathe. She had questioned the man who literally owned the airline. Treated him like he didn't belong. Humiliated him in front of other first-class passengers. Her career wasn't just on the line. It was already gone. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Rachel, do you have any idea what you've done? She forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. And did he say anything about it? Rachel shook her head. No. He just sat there. Like he was waiting. Reynolds and Patel exchanged a glance. That was worse. Marcus Reynolds had power. Real power. And he hadn't needed to argue, hadn't needed to demand anything. Because he knew the consequences were already in motion. Reynolds let out a sharp breath. You need to fix this. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. How? The captain's gaze was steely. You're going to apologize. Publicly. Rachel felt her entire body go cold. She had spent the entire flight doubting Marcus Reynolds, treating him as if he were an imposter. And now she had to face him. In front of everyone. And there was no way out. Rachel's stomach twisted painfully. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the look on Captain Reynolds' face told her otherwise. Patel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Let me get this straight. You spent the entire flight questioning the owner of the airline? Rachel couldn't answer. Her throat had gone completely dry. Reynolds rubbed a hand over his face, muttering under his breath. Unbelievable. He turned back to her, his voice sharp. You just treated Marcus Reynolds like a fraud. Like he didn't belong on his own plane? Rachel flinched at the words. Patel let out a low whistle. She's done. Rachel's breath hitched. Wait. But Reynolds wasn't finished. Do you have any idea what could happen next? He could have you fired before we even land. He could have corporate wiped your entire career off the map. Hell, he could have you escorted off this plane in handcuffs if he wanted to. Rachel swallowed hard, her vision tunneling. She had been so sure of herself. So convinced that something was off about Marcus. And now the truth was staring her in the face. She was the problem. She tried to steady her voice. What do I do? Reynolds' jaw tightened. You're going to make this right. Now. Rachel's stomach dropped. She already knew what that meant. Her hands trembled as she turned toward the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. The humiliation that was coming would be unlike anything she had ever experienced. But there was no way out. She had made her choice. And now she had to face the consequences. Rachel's legs felt like lead as she stepped into the first-class cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every step toward seat 1A felt agonizingly slow, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like an unbearable force. Lisa caught her eye from the galley, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But Rachel didn't stop. She couldn't. Passengers sensed the shift in energy. Conversations faded, subtle glances were exchanged, and a quiet tension filled the space. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew something was. And then she reached him. Marcus Reynolds sat as he had the entire flight, calm, composed, entirely unfazed. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't flipping through his magazine. He was just waiting. Rachel swallowed hard. She had humiliated him in front of everyone. Now she had to correct it in front of everyone. She took a breath, steeling herself, then spoke. "Mr. Reynolds?" A ripple of silence spread through the cabin as a few passengers subtly turned their heads. Marcus finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Rachel's palms were clammy, but she forced herself to continue. I need to apologize." Marcus didn't react. Didn't give her anything to work with. He just watched. Rachel's voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through. "Earlier I questioned your seat, your ticket, your right to be here. I made an assumption, and that was a mistake." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had witnessed it. They had let it happen. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, not in anger, not in amusement, just something else. Then for the first time he spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "And why did you assume I didn't belong?" Rachel felt her stomach twist. That was the question she had been dreading. She knew the answer. He knew the answer. Passengers were watching her now, not just out of curiosity but because they, too, were realizing what this moment was really about. Rachel's mouth felt dry. She could lie. She could give some excuse about his demeanor, about how quiet he had been. But Marcus Reynolds wasn't the kind of man who tolerated lies. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I made a bad judgment." Pause. Then, slowly, Marcus nodded, not in approval, not in forgiveness. Just in acknowledgement. Rachel's face burned. She had spent years believing she was good at her job, that she could read people, that she knew who belonged where. And tonight, in front of an entire first-class cabin, she had been forced to confront the truth. She had been wrong. And now she had to live with it. Rachel's chest tightened as the weight of his question pressed down on her. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. She knew the answer. He knew the answer. And now so did everyone else watching. Her throat felt dry as she struggled to find the right words, any words, but there was no excuse that could undo what had already been done. Marcus didn't rush her. He didn't demand an answer. He simply waited. Rachel swallowed hard. "Because I made a bad judgment." Marcus held her gaze, unblinking. What kind of judgment? Rachel felt her pulse hammering in her ears. The passengers around them were still, waiting for her response, waiting to see if she would tell the truth. Her voice wavered. "One I shouldn't have made." Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. For a moment he said nothing, just watching her, considering her words. The tension in the air was unbearable. Then finally he spoke. "You're right," he said evenly. "You shouldn't have." Rachel's breath caught. No anger. No raised voice. Just a simple, undeniable fact. The nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact. Others stole glances between Rachel and Marcus, as if waiting for what would happen next. Rachel forced herself to stand her ground. She had spent years believing she was good at her job, that she could read people, that she knew who belonged where. And now, in front of everyone, she was being forced to confront the truth. She had been wrong. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now but firm. "Truly?" Marcus studied her for another long moment, then nodded, just once. Not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, just in acknowledgement. Then, as if the conversation had never happened, he reached for his glass of water, took a sip, and turned his attention back to his magazine. It was over. But Rachel knew, this moment would stay with her forever. And she would never make that mistake again. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a slow, steady rhythm that only made Rachel's anxiety spike. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. And somehow that made it worse. Rachel forced herself to stand still, though every instinct screamed at her to move, to do something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But she had none. Not anymore. Marcus glanced at his phone again, his expression unreadable as he read whatever response had come through. Then, with the same frustrating composure he had maintained throughout the entire flight, he slid the device back into his pocket and looked up at her. "You should probably sit down." Rachel's stomach twisted. She had no seat, no place to go. She was supposed to be working, supposed to be ensuring that first-class passengers were comfortable, that everything ran smoothly. But none of that mattered anymore. She had messed up. And now she was just waiting to see how bad the consequences would be. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware that something bigger was happening. Whispers flickered through the cabin, but Rachel barely registered them. All she could focus on was Marcus. His fingers tapped against the armrest again, then stopped. He exhaled slowly, then spoke. "Go get the captain." Rachel's pulse spiked. The captain. A weight settled in her chest as she realized, this wasn't over. Not even close. Without a word, she turned on shaky legs and started the longest walk of her life back to the cockpit. She could feel the eyes on her, the way passengers pretended not to stare but were absolutely watching every move she made. By the time she reached the cockpit door, her hands were trembling. She knocked once. A second later, the door cracked open and Captain Reynolds' sharp gaze met hers. Rachel swallowed hard. "He wants to see you?" Reynolds didn't ask who. He already knew. With a curt nod, he stepped out of the cockpit and walked past her, heading straight for 1A. Rachel didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. Because whatever was about to happen next, she was sure she'd hear about it soon enough. Rachel barely made it over the threshold before Captain Reynolds shut the door behind her. The sound was final, like a gavel coming down on a sentence that had already been decided. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment pressed down on Rachel's chest, making it harder to breathe. First Officer Patel was watching her too, his expression unreadable but no less intense. The soft hum of the instruments in the cockpit was the only sound filling the space. Then finally Reynolds spoke. His voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "Sit down." Rachel's stomach twisted, but she obeyed, sinking into the small jump seat near the door. Reynolds crossed his arms, regarding her like she was a problem that needed solving. "Tell me exactly what happened." Rachel's hands clenched into fists against her lap. "I questioned a passenger," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I assumed he didn't belong." Reynolds' eyes didn't leave hers. "And?" Rachel inhaled sharply. "And I was wrong." A long silence stretched between them. Reynolds finally exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You weren't just wrong, Rachel. You embarrassed a man who could single-handedly decide whether this airline keeps running." Rachel's heart pounded. You ignored the warning signs," he continued, cutting her off. "You pushed. You doubted. And you did it in front of half the first-class cabin." Rachel swallowed hard. She couldn't argue. Every word was true. Patel shook his head. "Do you have any idea what happens now?" Rachel's throat tightened. She had a few ideas and none of them were good. Reynolds sighed heavily. "He wants to talk to you?" Rachel froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. Marcus Reynolds, the Marcus Reynolds, wanted to speak with her. Alone. This wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't just an apology. This was judgment. And whatever happened next, Rachel knew one thing for certain. Her fate was no longer in her hands. Rachel's stomach twisted violently. "You questioned his presence. You made him justify his own seat. You treated the owner of this airline like he didn't belong." Reynolds' voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "And now corporate is watching." Rachel's breath came short and shallow. Corporate is watching. That meant this wasn't just about Marcus Reynolds anymore. This was about the airline itself, about public image, about avoiding scandal, about ensuring that someone like her never made a mistake like this again. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say she had only been doing her job, that she had followed procedures, that she hadn't known who he was. But none of that mattered. Because the truth was, even if Marcus had been just another passenger, she had still treated him unfairly. And now she was paying the price. Captain Reynolds leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Security will escort you off the plane as soon as we land. You won't be returning to work until corporate decides what to do with you." Rachel swallowed hard. "And if they don't clear me?" Reynolds didn't blink. "Then you're done." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent years working her way up, handling difficult passengers, proving herself. And in a matter of hours she had thrown it all away. She barely felt herself nod as she turned toward the door, her body moving on autopilot. The cockpit felt smaller, suffocating. When she stepped back into the galley, Lisa was waiting, her expression tense. "Rachel, what's going on? What did he say?" Rachel could barely hear her over the pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure how she made it to the jump seat near the back of the galley, But suddenly she was sitting, hands gripping the edge of the cushion like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her career, her entire future, was no longer in her hands. And all she could do now was wait. Rachel could barely swallow past the lump in her throat. Marcus studied her, his expression giving nothing away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was simply waiting. Rachel felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see every thought racing through her mind, every regret, every mistake. "I was wrong," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Marcus exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. "I know." The simplicity of his response made her stomach twist even more. He didn't need to lecture her, he had already won. The power had shifted entirely, and there was nothing she could do to take it back. Rachel forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Marcus considered her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "Good." The word cut deeper than anything else he could have said. For the first time since this ordeal began, Rachel had nothing left to say. She had spent the entire flight doubting him, challenging him, treating him like he didn't belong. And yet he was the one showing her grace. Not by forgiving her, but by letting her sit with the weight of her own actions. Marcus tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest as if in thought. Then, with the same calm demeanor he had maintained all along, he said, "You should go." Rachel's breath caught. "Go?" He nodded once, his tone unreadable. "Your shift is over?" It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. Rachel didn't move at first. Her mind scrambled, trying to piece together what this meant. Was he saying she was fired? Was this his way of ending it quietly? But then she realized he wasn't having her escorted off the plane. He was giving her a choice. She could leave with whatever dignity she had left, or stay and let the humiliation continue. Rachel inhaled shakily, her fingers trembling at her sides. Then slowly she nodded. She turned on her heel, her steps measured, controlled, holding on to the last shred of composure she had left. She didn't look back. And Marcus didn't stop her. Rachel's breath caught. He changed his mind. Her heart pounded as she glanced toward Marcus, still seated in 1A, calm as ever. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't acknowledging what he had just done. He had simply decided. Michael's voice pulled her back. "I don't know what you said to him, but whatever it was, it worked." Rachel barely heard him. Her mind was spinning. She had been prepared for the worst, escorted off the plane, her career effectively over. Now, in a single moment, everything had shifted again. Marcus Reynolds had power. Real power. And he had just used it to spare her. But why? She turned back toward him, her hands clenched at her sides, searching his expression for an answer. But he didn't give her one. He simply picked up his magazine and resumed reading, as if the conversation had never happened. Rachel swallowed hard. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't an act of kindness. This was mercy. And somehow that made it even heavier. Lisa appeared beside her, lowering her voice. "Rachel, what does this mean?" Rachel exhaled slowly, forcing herself to steady her breathing. "It means I still have a job." Lisa hesitated. "For now." Rachel nodded once. Lisa was right. Just because Marcus had changed his mind about security didn't mean she was safe. It didn't mean corporate wouldn't still review her actions. It didn't mean she hadn't already altered the course of her career in ways she couldn't yet see. But it meant she had a chance. And she wasn't going to waste it. Straightening her uniform, Rachel took one last glance toward Marcus before turning and walking back toward the galley. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in hours she wasn't running from it. Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands moved on instinct, steadying the tray, adjusting the glass, making sure everything was perfect. It was the least she could do. Michael watched her, concern flickering across his face. "Rachel." She ignored him, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the galley and back into the first-class cabin. The air felt different now. Heavy. Charged. Passengers who had once silently watched her interrogate Marcus now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew. They had let it happen. And now they were feeling the weight of their own silence. But Rachel wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about him. Marcus Reynolds still sat in 1A, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge the shift in energy around him. He didn't need to. Rachel steadied herself as she reached his seat. She set the tray down gently, placing the perfectly arranged glass of sparkling water in front of him. "Mr. Reynolds," she said softly. Finally he looked up. Rachel forced herself to hold his gaze. "This is for you?" A small pause. Then Marcus glanced at the tray before shifting his eyes back to hers. "I didn't ask for anything." Rachel's throat felt tight. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Marcus reached for the glass, his fingers brushing against the cool condensation. He picked it up, took a slow sip and set it back down. Rachel stood there waiting. Marcus studied her for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. Rachel exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't need a response. She just needed to make it right. And somehow, in the smallest way, she had. Rachel felt every step as she moved away from 1A, her body heavy with the weight of the moment. The cabin wasn't the same. Passengers who had once ignored the interaction were now painfully aware. Some stole quick glances at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. Others looked away, uncomfortable, embarrassed not just for Rachel but for themselves. They had all witnessed it. They had watched her doubt him. And not one of them had spoken up. Rachel swallowed hard as she reached the galley, gripping the counter for support. Her hands were trembling, her chest tight. Lisa was still there, watching her carefully. Well? Lisa asked, voice cautious. Rachel let out a slow, unsteady breath. I think he just saved my career. Lisa frowned, processing that. And? Rachel exhaled, staring at the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. And I don't know why. Lisa studied her for a second before shaking her head. Maybe that's the lesson. Rachel didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. Because she had learned something tonight. Something bigger than a mistake on the job, bigger than a disciplinary review, bigger than a near career-ending moment. She had learned who she was. And who she didn't want to be anymore. Rachel squared her shoulders and straightened her uniform. This flight wasn't over yet. But she knew one thing for certain. When she walked off this plane, she wouldn't be the same person who had stepped onto it. And that was a start. Rachel had no words for what she was feeling. The cabin noise faded into the background, distant and unimportant. The weight in her chest, the tightness in her throat, none of it was going away. Lisa and Michael were still watching her, waiting for an explanation she couldn't give. Because this wasn't just about Marcus Reynolds anymore. It was about her. She had spent her career believing she knew how to handle people. Believing she could read them. Believing she was right. And in a single night, all of that had been shattered. Lisa's voice was softer this time. Rachel, what happens now? Rachel exhaled shakily, forcing herself to stand straighter, even as her hands trembled at her sides. I don't know. Michael hesitated. Do you think he's still going to report this? Rachel swallowed hard. That was the question, wasn't it? Marcus Reynolds had already shown her mercy once. But did that mean she was safe? Or was this just a delay before the inevitable? I guess I'll find out, she muttered. Lisa and Michael exchanged a glance but didn't push her further. They knew, this wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation. Rachel turned, peeking out from behind the curtain once more. Marcus was still there, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. Completely composed. Completely in control. Rachel forced herself to look away. She wasn't the same person who had started this flight. And when she walked off this plane, she knew, this moment would follow her. For the rest of her life. Lisa leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. She didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence. She just watched. Rachel exhaled, her fingers pressing harder against her temples. The weight of everything, the realization, the humiliation, the sheer finality of it all, settled deep in her chest. Marcus hadn't ruined her. He had forced her to live with it. If he had let security escort her off the plane, she could have justified it. Could have convinced herself she had been wronged, that she had just been following protocol, that it wasn't really her fault. But this was worse. Because now, every time she stepped onto a plane, every time she looked at a passenger, every time she made a judgment, she would think of him. Lisa sighed, breaking the silence. You're thinking too much. Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh. Am I? Lisa shrugged. You screwed up. But you're still here. Rachel's throat tightened. For now. Michael shifted beside them. You think corporate's still gonna come after you? Rachel shook her head. I don't know. That was the truth. Marcus Reynolds had the power to make a call and end her career with a single sentence. He hadn't done that, yet. But that didn't mean it was over. Lisa studied her for a long moment, then said, So what are you gonna do? Rachel blinked at her. What was she going to do? She had spent years believing she understood people. That she could handle any situation. That she wasn't the kind of person who made assumptions. But tonight had proved her wrong. Rachel straightened, inhaling deeply, the weight in her chest still heavy. I don't know, she admitted. But I need to be better. Lisa nodded slightly. Yeah, you do. Rachel didn't argue. Because for the first time she agreed. Rachel's fingers curled against the counter as Carla's question hung in the air. What was she supposed to do? What could she do? Her entire world had been flipped upside down, but she wasn't the only one. The first-class passengers, the people who had sat there in silence, who had let it happen, they were living with it too. Michael was right. Marcus Reynolds had never been powerless. He had let them reveal themselves. And now they all had to live with what they had seen. Rachel exhaled shakily. I don't know. Carla studied her, arms still crossed. Well, you're gonna have to figure it out. Rachel nodded slowly. She would figure it out. Because she couldn't afford not to. She turned back toward the curtain, peeking into the cabin once more. Marcus was still there, calm as ever, his phone in his hand, his water glass half empty. It was like nothing had happened. Except everything had. Rachel swallowed hard and stepped away from the curtain. She didn't have all the answers. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never make this mistake again. And neither would anyone else on this plane. Happened. But it had. And everyone knew it. Rachel moved through the first-class cabin, forcing herself to focus on her job. A refill here. A quiet nod there. She could still feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure which was worse, the passengers who stole quick, guilty glances, or the ones who looked straight through her, pretending nothing had changed. And then there was Marcus. Still seated in 1A, still composed, still completely at ease. He hadn't looked at her once since their last exchange. Rachel knew why. She wasn't worth his time. And somehow that stung more than anything else. She swallowed back the tightness in her throat and kept moving. She still had a job to do. At least for now. Lisa passed her near the galley, lowering her voice. You okay? Rachel forced a small nod. I'm fine. It was a lie. They both knew it. But Lisa didn't push. Because what was there to say? Rachel had walked onto this plane as one person. She would walk off as someone else entirely. And the only thing left to do was face it. Rachel moved back toward the galley, her steps lighter but her mind still heavy. The flight would land soon. People would gather their belongings, stretch their legs, and step off the plane as if this had just been another routine trip. Conversations would resume, emails would be checked, and life would move forward. But for Rachel, nothing about this flight had been routine. She stole one last glance toward Marcus. He had already returned to his magazine, his water glass resting untouched on the tray table. To anyone else it would seem like nothing had happened. But Rachel knew better. He had given her something invaluable, not punishment, not humiliation, but clarity. And that was something she wouldn't waste. Taking a steady breath, she squared her shoulders, smoothed out her uniform and prepared for landing. She didn't know what waited for her after this flight. But she knew one thing for certain, she would never make the same mistake again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something better.